Once you live in Boston a while, you have to come back.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
If you live a good life, God will reward you by taking you to Boston after you die.
Hello, everyone. Dr. J here, and welcome to my podcast. Today, I have an incredibly unique podcast because I sat down with Dr. Peter Kreeft, a friend of mine. We've been playing ping pong for years together, a couple times a week. And I try to simplify scientific research for normal people, just make it simple, understandable for normal people. Dr. Peter Kreeft simplifies philosophy in the same way for normal people, so normal people can understand and access it. And before the show, we actually talked about something I like to call fast food logic, which in other words is having things your way. Real shallow arguments that make you feel good, that are really quick, and not substantial, not healthy, not good, but a lot of people go for fast food logic, fast food thinking. And that's something I try to avoid because, being intellectually honest can take hard work and it can be complex. The world can be a complex place. It is a complex place. And there wouldn't be arguments if everything was super simple, easy, and clear. And so what we do in this discussion is we talk about how can we prove that God exists, number one. So we discuss God's existence. And we also discuss Christianity specifically. So we start with God and move into Christianity. And we go through the information quickly, extremely quickly here because of time restraints. But during the discussion, I made an attempt to really recommend some of the best resources on this topic so that if you're honest and you're open-minded and you're looking into this, you'll find the best stuff. I don't want you looking at mediocre minds and mediocre arguments when there's some excellent resources out there. And that includes, by the way, the debate from a friend of mine, Mark Miravalle. His brother was my roommate in college. And I'm actually going to include sections of that debate, just the opening arguments from Mark Miravalle debating a person, Dan Barker, because it's relevant to our discussion with Dr. Peter Kreeft. And Mark Miravalle does an excellent job of simplifying some of these concepts as well. All right, I hope you enjoy, and I hope you find this discussion valuable. Hello everyone, so I'm here today with the famous Dr. Peter Kreeft from Boston College. You've written how many books? 50 plus books?
Is there a famous one too?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. It must be my evil twin.
Well, I've heard of you from Minnesota when I was in Minnesota, so. No, but one of the things that I really admire about your work is that you simplify theology and philosophy. And, so normal people like me and scientists and just anybody can read and understand some of these concepts that a lot of people struggle with, like suffering. Like how can God be good and yet suffering exists? Yep. Moral relativism is a big one. So in other words, this idea that people have their own truth, my truth and your truth and that. And then a big one, and what I really want to talk about today, maybe we can even touch on some of those, but a big one is just the existence of God, because my audience is predominantly health and fitness people, and people in kind of that audience struggle with agnosticism, skepticism in terms of God's existence, or they're downright atheists frequently. Hey, Bob.
Two questions.
Yeah.
One, I was wondering, get something on the name of your book. And
yeah, I'll give you a card for it.
I was just thinking there was a great basketball player from the University of Massachusetts, Julius Erving.
Oh, Dr.
Oh, wow.
J.
Dr. J.
Got another Dr. J.
Oh, he was that kind of a doctor. I didn't know that.
No, he's not.
He was one of the greatest basketball players from
before
University
Jordan.
of Massachusetts. And
Yeah.
Are you here just for the day, or?
I fly out today. Yeah.
Well, we missed the whole family.
Oh, thanks,
We're
Bob.
happy that
Yeah.
we have had a chance to meet and know you folks.
Oh, we'll be back to visit for sure. Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. So essentially, a lot of these scientists are either confused or they've never actually heard a decent argument for the existence of God. Mm-hmm. And so, today I want to talk generally about the existence of God to start with, and how do we know for sure that God exists, mm-hmm. And specifically like which deity God is, right? There's Allah, there's mm-hmm. Zeus, there's all these deities. Things like that. Mm-hmm. So that's just God generally. And then maybe transition later specifically into mm-hmm. Christianity and how we know that would be true. Okay. So would you maybe start with the existence of God?
Well, when people ask whether you can prove that God exists or not, they usually mean, can you prove everything that the Bible tells you about God? And the answer is no. Because a lot of the things that God does are up to him, his choice. He didn't have to create a world. He didn't have to create you. He didn't have to send his son to die. He didn't have to choose the Jews as his chosen people. He didn't have to set up a church. But that there is a perfect being, an eternal being who created the universe, that can be proved by pure logic. There are, in fact, dozens of proofs of the existence of God. The most obvious one is order in nature. Intelligent design. It may not be a scientific proof because design is neither empirical nor quantitative, so it can't be detected by merely the scientific method, but it certainly can be detected by common sense and good philosophy. The fact that the universe, as any scientist would say, is a system of interrelated forces and laws and events that vastly surpasses the human ability to design. We can design a car, but we can't design a solar system, has led thoughtful people throughout the centuries to think that there is at least some great mind behind the universe. Einstein, for instance, was definitely a theist, although he was skeptical of all the organized religions. You can also prove that there's a first cause of all the matter in the universe. Big Bang cosmology confirms that. If there's a Big Bang, there must be a Big Banger. The effect proceeds only from a cause that's adequate to produce the effect. So what in the universe, what part of the universe has the power to produce the whole universe? It's a silly question. None. So there must be something greater than the universe that's capable of producing it. The attributes of God, some of them at least, can be seen from the nature of the universe. I mentioned intelligence, beauty. God must be a great artist. I think there's no greater work of art in all reality than the entire universe. And if you turn to your internal experience, as distinct from your external sense experience, you find an even stronger picture of God. Your conscience always comes to you with obligation. It's not a set of ideals. It's not this would be a nice thing to do. You ought to be good, whatever good means. And even if you differ with other people about the content of good, even if you quarrel with, let's say, the content of the Ten Commandments, still, whatever your intellect tells you to do, whatever your mind says, this is the true good, you have to do it. Now, where did conscience get that absolute authority? If it's nothing but the voice of society or the voice of your parents or nothing but a genetic accident, why bow down to that and obey it? But we all believe, even moral relativists believe, that it's wrong to disobey your own individual conscience. Well, a perfect being would be the only one that has the right to total obedience. So there's another argument for at least a very thick slice of God.
Wow, yeah, so you added moral relativism into that, and the goodness of God, essentially. You were hinting at the goodness of God, Not just that God exists, but that we can prove that God is good. Is that a fair assessment?
I think there's evidence for the goodness of God in conscience. We're obligated to do the good, absolutely, but we're not obligated to do any evil. There are also reasonable doubts. The evil in human life, the fact that if there's a God, he doesn't automatically eradicate evil, even though he could. Why doesn't he perform perpetual miracles? Why does he let innocent people die? That's evidence against the existence of God. And that's why intelligent people are not automatically theists. Mm-hmm. It takes something of a leap of faith, of trust. It's like a little child looking at his parents And his parents give him all sorts of things that are obviously good, food and cuddling and a warm blanket at night. And they also do things that he doesn't understand. Why in the world do I have to dress in these ugly and uncomfortable clothes? Why do I have to go to the doctor when he causes me some pain, and the dentist? So it comes to a choice. You can choose to trust, or you can choose not to trust.
So you have some PragerU videos that people should watch also on some of these topics?
Yeah,
And those are
they're
good.
pretty short and simple.
Yep. And in there, you kind of touch upon the difference between, moral evil, in other words, people inflicting evil on themselves. And I think atheists, theists, we all recognize that. And that doesn't, negate God's existence in any way.
Because we're responsible for that, not God.
That's right. But where people, I think, really struggle is the natural, these like natural disasters like earthquakes or hurricanes or disease, right? Or even birth defects, especially things like that.
Moral evil is much more serious than physical evil, but it's easier to explain if you believe in free will, and all commonsensical people do. Physical evil is harder to explain. My take on that is simply that if God had not created a physical universe which worked according to its own laws, if he had given the human mind the power to alter the physical universe simply by thinking differently, we would not really have any free will. Because as soon as you shoot a bullet at me, I turn it to butter and it doesn't hit my brain. Then we don't have the choice between good and evil because we can't do evil.
Yeah, and what about some of these cases that are real strange in nature, for example, like where wasps lay eggs on a caterpillar that's alive and it eats the caterpillar and things like that?
Or the Australian ant that divides into two parts and they eat each other.
Yeah, these really gruesome things. And people say, well, how could there possibly be a divine plan behind some of that?
Well, first of all, that's anthropomorphic. If people did that, we would condemn them with passion. But these are not people. These are organisms. Secondly, there's got to be some sort of basic principle or law that we use to judge those things as bad. So the very fact that there's bad things presupposes an absolute standard of good versus bad. So even though there are cases that make us doubt, the principles that are the foundation for our judgment of those cases are much more certain. And the principles have to be good rather than bad.
Interesting.
So those don't point in the direction of moral relativism, just the opposite. They also show us that we're not God. We didn't design the universe, and we don't know why lions have to eat lambs.
Yeah, and I recommend people for sure to check out your book on moral relativism, because we're just barely touching the surface here, but that goes through it in depth.
It's a set of strictly philosophical arguments between a relativist and an absolutist. And moral relativism collapses.
And it's simplified. I mean, that's the most important thing. That's what I try and do when I write scientific books for people. Make it easy and understandable, and that's what you do.
I'm not
really
a professional philosopher. I'm not smart enough to be a professional philosopher. You say that I translate philosophy into ordinary language. No, I think in ordinary language, and I write in ordinary language.
Well, it helps a lot of people. And the other book that I recommend people for sure read is your book on suffering. I can't remember what it's called.
Making Sense Out of Suffering.
Making Sense Out of Suffering, because I've read C.S. Lewis's book, The Problem of Pain,
Yep.
and I honestly thought that your book did a better job, at least from my perspective, as a scientist, just really understanding the depth of.
My publisher asked me to write that book, and I said, I can't write a better book than C.S. Lewis's The Problem of Pain. And my publisher said, we don't want you to write a better book. People can't understand C.S. Lewis anymore. They're not that bright.
Yeah, that's
I said, well, maybe I can write a semi-good book on it.
Yeah, that's that's definitely my situation, apparently. And one other, again, because we're going through this rapidly, do you have a book on the existence of God, some of these arguments? I'm sure you have a book you can recommend specifically.
Handbook of Christian Apologetics
Yep.
Has 24 arguments for the existence of God in one of its chapters. The best argument, especially for someone somewhat scientifically minded, the best book that I know on the evidence for the existence of God is Who Designed the Designer by Michael Augros, Augros.
Oh, okay. I'll check it out. Yeah, and a friend of mine, and I know the Miravalles are a friend of yours also, John Mark Miravalle did a debate on the existence of God that's really interesting. And he talks about essential versus non-essential features, and how they're, like, for example, a triangle has essential features, like three sides.
Right.
And non-essential features, like it's a blue triangle or something else that can change, but it's still a triangle.
Right.
And how that's actually a proof for the existence of God based on, we as humans are non-essential.
To the universe.
To the universe, yeah. But there has to be something, everything is just passing the buck until you find an essential being.
Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Mark Miravalle. It's my job to defend God's existence, which is a weird position to be in, since what I'm really looking forward to is hearing God defend my existence, especially since I don't think I've given him quite as good a case as he's given me. But I have three proofs tonight that God exists, one from metaphysics, one from ethics, and one from logic. And the proof from metaphysics has about 3 steps. The first step notices that things have essential features and things have non-essential features. And an essential feature is a feature that a thing has just based on what it is, in virtue of its own internal structure, whereas a non-essential feature is a feature that a thing just happens to have. So I took great care in drawing this triangle for our event tonight, and you will see, I hope you like it, this triangle has 3 sides. Now that's an essential feature of a triangle. A triangle has to have 3 sides just based on what it is. It's part of what it means to be a triangle. But you'll notice too that this triangle is blue. That's a non-essential feature. A triangle doesn't have to be blue, it could just as easily be black or red or green. And you really see this difference between essential and non-essential features come out when people ask questions about them. So for instance, I have a son, he's 3, he'll be 4 tomorrow, and he could come up to me and say, Daddy, why does that triangle have 3 sides? And that's a question about an essential feature, and it shows he doesn't quite know what he's talking about. And the only way I can answer his question is if I say, well, son, a triangle has to have 3 sides. That's part of what it means to be a triangle. I have to return again and refer to the thing itself. Whereas if he asks me about a non-essential feature and says, Daddy, why is the triangle blue? I say, good question. That's a question about a non-essential feature. The triangle doesn't have to be blue. It just happens to be blue. Why is it blue? And the only way I can answer his question is by referring to something other than the triangle. I say, well, son, the triangle is blue because I had a blue marker. You see, so the difference is fairly clear. But now go to step 2, and you will see that the existence of the things in the world is a non-essential feature. For instance, my son, if he came to me and said, Daddy, why does this triangle exist? Where did it come from? Why does it have existence? I would answer his question about the triangle's existence, so I'd answer his question about a non-essential feature. I'd say, good question, the triangle doesn't have to exist. Why does it exist? And I'd answer his question by referring to something other than the triangle. I'd say, well, the triangle exists because I made it, I drew it, I gave it existence. But then, of course, he could redirect the same question to me. But Daddy, why do you have existence? And that's a good question too, because for me existence is a non-essential feature. I don't have to exist. It's a shame, but I don't have to exist. I didn't exist for a very long time. I won't exist in a few decades sooner than that if I don't floss, I'm told. And that's true of everything else in the universe. It's a reasonable question to say, why does it exist? And the only way you can answer questions about these things that exist non-essentially, that pass in and out of existence, is by referring to something other than the thing itself. So here's step 3. Step 3 shows that if you want to find an explanation for a non-essential feature, you can only find it in a source of that feature, a source which possesses that feature essentially. So I brought a magnet today. I have all kinds of props, and you'll see the magnet has some, well, I don't know if you can see, but the magnet has some nails and some paper clips. hanging down from it. And they're all magnetized because they're connected to the magnet. Now someone could say, why is that nail right there magnetic? And that's a great question. Because magnetism is a non-essential feature for a nail. Nails don't have to be magnetic. This nail wasn't magnetic before I connected it to the chain from the magnet. And someone could say, okay, well, it's a non-essential feature. Let's answer the question by referring to something other than the thing. Well, this nail has gained its magnetism from this nail above it. Okay, but that just prolongs the question, doesn't it? Because that second nail, that nail right above it, also possesses magnetism as a non-essential feature. You see, so you come to realize that whether you can see it or not, somewhere nearby there has to be a magnet that is supplying, that is acting as a source of the magnetism. There has to be a source of magnetism that itself possesses magnetism essentially, in virtue of what it is. And that's what we mean by a magnet. And if someone were to ask, why is the magnet magnetic? It'd be like asking, why does that triangle have 3 sides? The only way you could answer it is by saying, well, that's what the thing is. You have to return again to the thing. This thing is magnetic. This magnet is magnetic based on its own internal structure, based on what it is. But then, if that's how we explain non-essential features, then we have to conclude that the existence, the non-essential existence of all the things in the universe can only be explained by a source of existence which itself possesses existence as an essential feature based on what it is. Where to ask, why does this source exist is like asking, why is the magnet magnetic? Why does the triangle have 3 sides? The only way you can answer that question is to say, well, that's what it means to be the source of existence. It means to have existence essentially. This thing exists based on what it is, based on its own internal structure. And this essentially, necessarily existing source, this thing that has to exist the way a magnet has to be magnetic, the way a triangle has to have 3 sides. This necessarily existing, essentially existing source of existence we call God. And by the way, don't think you can get out of it by appealing to some sort of infinite quantity of things, because that won't help. If I were to say, why is that magnet magnetic? And someone said, well, there's an infinity of magnetized nails. That wouldn't answer the question. The question wasn't how many magnetized nails are there. The question was, where are these magnetized nails getting their magnetism? If I draw a dot on a piece of paper, someone says, where'd that come from? I say, well, I drew it. But supposing it were possible for me to draw an infinity of dots on a piece of paper, and someone said, where'd all those dots come from? And I say, well, there's an infinity of them. That's not the question. The question wasn't how many dots are there. The question is, where do these dots come from? So too, when the question, why do things exist? There can never be a legitimate answer in saying, well, there's an infinity of existing things in the universe. That's not the question. Not how many there are. Where are they getting their existence? And the answer can only be this necessarily existing source of existence that we call God. That's the first proof. The second proof. And this proof starts out by noticing that we have moral convictions. Pretty obvious. We all have moral convictions. Let's take one that we all share, I assume. We all know that it's wrong to torture children for pleasure. But here's the question, ready? Here is the question. Where do we get that knowledge from? Where do we get our moral convictions from? There's a couple possible answers. Someone could say, well, we get our moral knowledge by looking out at the natural world, by examining the facts of life. But that doesn't work because the natural world, the facts of life show us what is the case, where our moral convictions are about what ought to be the case, and there's a clear dissymmetry there. Those two don't line up. The facts of life, the natural world, shows us that it is the case that some people torture children for pleasure. Whereas our moral convictions tell us that it ought not to be the case that some people torture children for pleasure. So they don't line up. You can't get your moral convictions by looking out at the natural world because the natural world doesn't show you a moral picture. So someone might say, well, let's try this. Maybe we get our moral convictions from within ourselves. Maybe our moral convictions are expressions of our own desires, choices, preferences, instincts. But that doesn't work either, for a couple of reasons. One is, you notice we're always very careful to show that the truth of our moral convictions is independent of our own personal situation. If I see someone torturing a child, I say, stop. He might say, why? Don't you like it? Don't you choose to live this way? I say, well, of course I don't like it, don't choose to live that way, but that's not the point. There's lots of things I don't like, don't choose to do. I don't like or choose to eat peanut butter and mustard sandwiches. But I wouldn't tell someone to stop. I wouldn't say, don't eat peanut butter and mustard sandwiches, it's wrong. You see, I'm not telling you to stop torturing children because I have a problem with it, but because it's sick and it's wrong and you mustn't do it. Also notice this. When our desires, preferences, choices, instincts are frustrated, what do we feel? We feel disappointment. Whereas, when our moral convictions are frustrated, what do we feel? We feel moral indignation and outrage, and those two are not the same. I may apply for a job and get turned down for it, and I may be disappointed, but I don't necessarily feel outraged. Maybe that was the right decision. Maybe I just wasn't a good fit for the job. Or I may go looking for cookies in the cupboard, find there aren't any. I'm disappointed, but I don't become indignant. Nothing evil happened. Just no cookies, bummer. Whereas when my moral convictions are frustrated, I feel indignation. I feel that something wrong, something evil is happening. You see, so they can't be the same because the experiences that we have when each one is frustrated are vastly different. So someone might say, well, our moral convictions are determined by the larger culture as a whole, right? Society at large, the given authority figures in any given age, any given setting, that's what determines our sense of right and wrong. That obviously doesn't work either for two reasons. One is, if that were the case, we could never meaningfully talk about social progress, right? We could never say that we've become more ethical, say, in our treatment of women, in our treatment of minorities. Because to be able to say that presupposes that you can take two cultures side by side and compare them against some other standard and say, yeah, this culture is doing better than that one on this issue. And we obviously say that, which shows that the culture can't be its own standard. There must be some other standard that we can compare cultures against. Also notice this, if the culture was what determined our sense of right and wrong, then the very idea of social reform would be a contradiction in terms. Because social reform happens when an individual or a small group of people stand up for what is right against the culture at large, against the general social ethos. But if the general societal ethos was what determined what was right, you could never stand up for what is right against it. But that's precisely what happens. We applaud those people who are brave enough to stand up for what is right, even against the mob, even against the large group, which shows that the large group isn't what determines what's right. That rules out a lot of options, right? We've ruled out, as a source of our moral convictions, we have ruled out the natural world, we have ruled out ourselves, and we have ruled out other people. What's left? Well, some source that goes beyond, that transcends ourselves, that transcends other people, and that transcends the natural world. And this transcendent moral source, this transcendent source of our sense of right and wrong, we call God.
That's a rather abstract argument, a little bit like St. Anselm's famous ontological argument. If God has all perfections, he must have the perfection of existing independent of the human mind as well as others. I'm a little skeptical of abstract arguments. Maybe I'm not too bright, but I prefer concrete arguments, like there is motion in the universe, and therefore there must be some first mover.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure, especially with the Hubble telescope, that all of these galaxies and things are moving away, and you can extrapolate them back to a specific point, which is the Big Bang.
Yeah.
And again, I think there's a big difference between actually open-minded agnostic people that are, being honest with themselves, and people that are bitter, especially with these Bible verses where people aren't being honest about the Bible and they're picking out these verses. And we'll talk about those. I want to bring those up in a second when we talk Christianity. But I think the people that are really honest about this, recognize that's a real significant.
I'm old enough to remember when Big Bang had not yet been established. It was simply a theory, and the steady state theory and the oscillating universe theory were the two that were competing. And all the atheist astronomers argued that Big Bang was just creationism in disguise. It happened to be first formulated by a Jesuit priest. Isn't that suspicious? And now everybody accepts Big Bang. The evidence is overwhelming.
Right. The reason I talk about entrenched atheists, radical atheists versus just agnostic, open-minded people is the entrenched atheists. They say, well, but there's multiverses. And
there's not the slightest evidence for a multiverse. It's possible. It's mathematically conceivable.
That's right.
It's a consistent theory. So is the theory that monkeys are really extraterrestrials. Or that the universe produces orange tigers hanging by the tail from trees. Almost any universe is conceivable. It doesn't mean it's actual.
Yeah. Have you debated any of those people, like Neil Tyson deGrasse or Richard Dawkins?
I debated Kai Nielsen once.
Yeah.
He's a very intelligent atheist. And the result, according to the audience, which consisted of 90% atheists, was a draw. So I was kind of pleased at that.
Yeah, it's an interesting world we live in where people take pride in their atheism and they see themselves as more rational than everybody else.
Well, there's two kinds of atheists and two kinds of theists. There are the open-minded type that go by reason, and then there are the fundamentalists who say, I must be right, and that's my premise, so you're an idiot.
Yeah. So let's move maybe to Christianity, if this is good timing.
Yeah.
So if God exists, and God is good, and we have this moral compass, all these things we've been talking about, where do you begin in terms of presenting a case for Christianity? I mean, C.S. Lewis wrote a great book called Mere Christianity, and I know you probably teach it in your classes. And if I remember, he probably starts with the resurrection.
Well, he starts with evidence for the existence of God, and then he asks, is there any evidence that God has done anything to reveal himself in history? And he mentions the Jewish people who claim to have received a revelation from God, and then he points out that among these people, a man shows up who claims to be the Son of God. And that's such a challenging claim that it has to be dealt with somehow or other. There are over 2 billion people in the world who believe it. So here is Jesus Christ, a man who claims to be the God of the Jews, become human flesh. That's either true or false. If it's false, it's either the most blasphemous and wicked claim that anybody ever made, or it's the evidence of the greatest insanity that's ever occurred to a human mind. Because the gap between you and God is infinite. If you believe you're just the smartest person in the world, you're just an idiot and an egotist, but you're not insane. But if you believe God, you're insane. But almost nobody believes that Jesus is insane or is a blaspheming liar. So the only third possibility is that he is who he claims to be.
Especially in terms of the resurrection, right?
Well, the miracles are evidence. They're not conclusive proofs, but they're very strong evidence. And the biggest miracle of all is resurrecting from the dead. What other human being has ever done that?
Right.
Not Buddha, not Mohammed, not Moses, not any other great religious founder.
And so you think that would be the most defining feature that separates Jesus from, all these other,
Well, yes, if you go by the New
prophets.
Testament, every sermon preached by every Christian in the New Testament centers on the resurrection. And the historical evidence for the resurrection is very, very good by the principles of simply secular history. There was a guy named Frank Morrison who was an atheist who tried to disprove Christianity. He was a historian who was very scientific, and he tried to refute the resurrection. He realized that was central to Christianity. He ended up converting. He said the evidence is so strong. And his book, written in 1928, is still in print, called Who Moved the Stone?
Wow. Yeah, I guess we're getting a lot of books in there for people to read.
Yep.
But this is something that's so important. I think people should do their homework. They need to do their homework.
Of course, if you're honest, you look at the data first before you form your theories.
That's right. Now, going back just a second to the Old Testament, why did God specifically pick out this Jewish community as the enlightened, chosen people?
Well, for the sake of the world. We focus our attention much more easily than we dissipate it. So just as God inspires a particular prophet for the whole people, he inspired a particular people for the whole world. He's pretty clear about that at the beginning of their history through Moses. He says, I didn't pick you out because you're better than anybody else. I picked you out simply because that's the way I do things.
Oh, yeah. So now people are wondering, what about the Greeks, or what about these other people? Can they be saved and go to heaven?
Well, of course they can, because Jesus is the universal Savior. According to John's Gospel, he's the light that enlightens everyone who comes into the world. And when Paul writes his epistle to the Romans, he mentions 2 ways that God does reveal himself to everybody, not just Jews and Christians. One is nature, the great power and intelligence in nature, and the other is conscience, the absoluteness of conscience.
So assuming they're following their conscience.
If they're truly following their conscience, they're seeking God, and according to our highest authority, Jesus Christ himself, all who seek will find.
Yeah.
He didn't say how or when, but No, God is not going to give you a theology test at the gate of heaven and flunk you if you get only a 59.
So what about these Bible passages? Especially, let's maybe start with going back to the Old Testament. And by the way, I'll throw another book out there because I have a friend, Matthew Ramage, at the Benedictine College in Kansas, and he just wrote an excellent book called The Dark Passages of the Bible, where he goes through some of these passages that people essentially like to cherry pick and say, well, what about this and what about that? And so I recommend that book because, if you're reading these things in context, generally there's a really obvious explanation.
Yeah.
But let's maybe just jump around with a few of them.
Okay.
Not gloss over, excuse me. But starting with some of these laws that were specific to the Jews, like the eating meat or this or that. I mean, what about those type of seemingly arbitrary laws given by God that were later discarded?
Well, they're clearly given only for one people and one culture and one time. As you say, they're later discarded. They're like the laws that we give to our small children. They're not for all time. Some laws are for all time, like the Ten Commandments. But we grow. So you have to talk to primitive people in primitive language. God gets across justice first and then mercy. Because if you don't begin with justice, mercy is cheap. So there's rather shocking things in the Old Testament, like God commands aggressive warfare. And then later, when people are more morally mature, the emphasis is on mercy and forgiveness.
Yeah. There's this verse I specifically wrote down here also. I actually wrote down a couple, but I think that you just essentially covered the first one. Now this one I want to read is in 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 23. It starts on verse 23. And it's about Elijah essentially calling down a curse on people and bears coming out and
yes.
killing these people. Yeah, you've heard this because, again, people use these things as sledgehammers, right? They pull these specific verses out, and this is one of the classics. And I just want to read it for people so they understand this context. It says, "From there Elijah went up to Bethel." This is after Baal and all this. And as he was walking along the road, some boys came out of the town and jeered at him. "Get out of here, Baldy," they said. I don't know if the translation is very good, but "Get out of here, Baldy." He turned around, looked at them, and called down a curse on them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the boys. And Elijah went on to Mount Carmel, and from there he returned to Samaria. So what do you say when people bring these things up? Especially this one verse.
That saints are not perfect. That Elijah was rather primitive and cruel there. He clearly believed in justice but not mercy, so that was certainly an incomplete ethics. The Bible doesn't say that we ought to do what Elijah did.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, so you're saying essentially that God gave Elijah this certain amount of
power, and he misused it at that point. Yeah.
Right. And I think either there's probably a lot of that going on in certain situations where people cherry pick, or what seems to me what happens more often is the context. People just are not looking at the context.
Especially the big, long historical context, the Bible as a whole.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should touch on that because Scott Hahn has an excellent book, A Father Who Keeps His Promises. And when I used to teach religious education, that's what I start with. I essentially start with understanding the big picture of the Old Testament, because one of the early church fathers, and I think maybe shifting gears from Christianity towards Catholicism specifically, is looking at the early church fathers. One of them in 200 AD or something said, if you don't understand the covenants, you can't understand the Bible.
Yeah, that's God's strategy.
And it's unbelievable because God essentially started with Adam, this one-man covenant, and then went to Noah with a family covenant, and this is a progression. And then he went to Abraham, and there was tribes, and Dave. I'm missing one here, but I was going to jump to David with kingdoms, and then Jesus with the universal covenant, because the word Catholic means universal.
Yep.
And that seems to be the big picture. I think Scott Hahn has a really good point there, and people overlook that these days or just forget about it. Whereas in the early church, I think people really recognize that big picture, and they really taught that, and I think people need to recognize that. So maybe moving from Christianity generally to Catholicism specifically, especially because you're a convert.
Yep.
Why are you a Catholic?
Well, the answer to that is very simple, because Jesus established a single visible church, which he gave authority to teach in his name. And no Protestant denomination claims to be that single universal church, but the Catholic Church does. The historical facts about the history of the church led me to the conclusion that what Protestants have to believe simply isn't true, namely that Jesus established a Protestant church, which gradually became heretical and Catholic and bad in the Middle Ages. But all the specifically Catholic doctrines, the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist and the authority of the church itself, and the need for good works as well as faith to be saved, these were not controversies until the Reformation. There's a seamless web of the evolution of doctrine for 1,500 years.
Do you have a specific book that is a compilation of the early church fathers, the writings from the early church, that you recommend to people, or should people just,
Well, there are such books.
Is Jurgens the 3-part volume or whatever?
That's a long one. I was just on the road exploring and read a lot of things from Justin Martyr and Clement of Alexandria and St. Augustine. It wasn't a scientific, exact journey, but everywhere on the road I met clues that pointed in the same direction. This is the church that Jesus founded. So that's the basic historical question.
Yeah, and for people listening, in John 6, somewhere around verse 50, when he talks about, I am the bread of life, you must eat my flesh and drink my blood, that's a particular verse that people struggle with because, they can't seem to reconcile that with just normal reason. But for people people need to realize at the end of that verse, it says many of his disciples drew back and no longer went about with him. I mean, people right there, sitting right next to Jesus, right after he had done all these miracles and everything, they were leaving, they were struggling with that.
Yep.
And so...
In other cases, when his disciples misunderstood his words, and he meant them symbolically, and they interpreted it literally, he corrected them. He didn't correct them in this point. He let them leave.
That's right. And the early church fathers are real specific about that.
There wasn't a single Christian in the world for 1,000 years who denied the literal, real, complete presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Berenger of Tours was the first heretic who denied it around the year 1000, and he was condemned as a heretic, and he later repented. And not until the Reformation did you get a significant number of Christians who denied that. Well, if that's not true, that's a terrible piece of stupid idolatry. Catholics are bowing down to bread, worshiping wine, thinking that it's Jesus Christ.
Right.
So that's not some little issue out in left field. That's not trivial.
Yeah, and these heresies, what's interesting about atheism is around St. Thomas Aquinas' time, around even back as far as Augustine, a lot of these heresies, these arguments against the existence of God especially, we've seen these, for thousands of years, right?
Oh, yeah.
A lot of them are just rehashed varieties of the same arguments you watch on YouTube debates. People think that we're so enlightened as a society, and as a whole, people are becoming atheists because, now we recognize that the truth of science and evolution and all this.
Well, this is one of the
it's really not a new argument.
This is one of the great myths of our time, the so-called war between science and religion. The war has 0 casualties. There is not a single religious doctrine that has ever been refuted by a single scientific discovery in the entire history of the world. If you challenge that statement, show me the contradiction between science and religion, in particular, not just in general. But when people talk about the conflict between science and religion, they're always talking about abstraction. Science with a capital S, religion with a capital R.
So, in certain religions, probably all religions, people sometimes use, religion as a way of doing some pretty, cruel things or, right, extreme things. What do you say about that?
There's an old Latin cliche, corruptio optimi pessima, the corruption of the best things or the worst things. If religion is one of the best things in human life, then it can be corrupted much more than something much less. You can corrupt economics, but that only takes away your money, not your soul. You can bend paper clips, but that only means that it doesn't connect the paper very well. Little things can be only corrupted in a little way. Great things can be corrupted in a great way. Just imagine that someone like Nietzsche, or if you don't know him, Adolf Hitler, was a Christian, and he used all that cleverness and intelligence and passion for good rather than for evil. He was one of the greatest saints of the century, but he used it for evil. So the more power you have, the more harm you can do, and the more good you can do.
And maybe jumping back to the first popes, and even all the way up from popes till today, sometimes people look at that and they say, well, they misunderstand infallibility, first of all. So maybe we should just explain infallibility before anything else about popes.
Yeah, when Christ gave to his church the authority to speak in his name, that was the church as a whole. He didn't mean that there would be no errors and no heretics and no false opinions. But the church is unified by the Pope, and when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, or infallibly, he speaks in the name of the whole church. One of the earliest formulas for infallibility was the Vincentian canon. This has been believed by all Christians at all times and all places. So the Catholic Church does not invent any new dogmas. It simply defines and clarifies the old ones, which it calls the deposit of faith, which was received from Christ 2,000 years ago in the first place. And there have been quite wicked popes in history, especially around the time of the Renaissance. And the wicked popes never changed the doctrine, even though some of them probably didn't believe it themselves, but God preserved them from any official error. So the church has been amazingly consistent throughout its history in its teaching.
So these are sinful people,
Yeah,
but they're not necessarily, they're not
morally infallible.
Altering teachings of the church.
Right. And the Pope is not infallible in his private judgments. If he tells you to invest in a certain stock, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get rich.
Right. And, a lot of times you hear people kind of laughing or making fun of seemingly arbitrary rules regarding Lent or regarding eating fish or whatever. Now, are those infallible teachings, or are those just rules, or what do you say about those type of things?
Those are authoritative rules because they come from a teaching authority, but they're not dogmas, and they're not unchangeable. For instance, the regulations about Lenten fast, this has changed throughout history. The regulations about married priests, that's changed throughout history. Just as your parents can change the rules of the house, it's not raining out, so you don't have to wipe your feet today. So the church can change the rules of its house, the operating rules, but it can't change what it received from Christ, the theological and moral principles.
Probably one of the last things that's coming to my mind, I think, is this idea of dogma and open-mindedness. How should people that are listening be approaching divine revelation, natural revelation, and should they be open-minded, as the culture says, or should they be closed-minded, right? Are Catholics closed-minded? Is that encouraged by Catholics?
An open mind is absolutely essential. If you don't seek, you won't find. Jesus saying, seek and you shall find, really implicitly divides the world into three categories of people. People who seek and haven't found yet, people who seek and have found, and people who don't seek and therefore don't find. There's no fourth class. There's no people who find without seeking. So an open mind, that is the honest search for truth, is absolutely essential. But it's not the end, it's the means. It's like Chesterton says, an open mind is like an open mouth. You can't eat without opening your mouth, but you don't keep your mouth open forever. Once you live in Boston a while, you have to come back.
Oh, yeah.
If you live a good life, God will reward you by taking you to Boston after you die.
Hello, everyone. Dr. J here, and welcome to my podcast. Today, I have an incredibly unique podcast because I sat down with Dr. Peter Kreeft, a friend of mine. We've been playing ping pong for years together, a couple times a week. And I try to simplify scientific research for normal people, just make it simple, understandable for normal people. Dr. Peter Kreeft simplifies philosophy in the same way for normal people, so normal people can understand and access it. And before the show, we actually talked about something I like to call fast food logic, which in other words is having things your way. Real shallow arguments that make you feel good, that are really quick and not substantial, not healthy, not good, but a lot of people go for fast food logic, fast food thinking. And that's something I try to avoid because, being intellectually honest can take hard work and it can be complex. The world can be a complex place. It is a complex place. And there wouldn't be arguments if everything was super simple, easy, and clear. And so what we do in this discussion is we talk about how can we prove that God exists, number one. So we discuss God's existence. And we also discuss Christianity specifically. So we start with God and move into Christianity. And we go through the information quickly, extremely quickly.